Well, good evening from a sweltering London. I think it's 36 or 37 degrees. I hope you're all keeping as cool as possible. And welcome to another lockdown lecture with Harif, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. For those who don't know us, we aim to educate about the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We have a website, www.harif.org, and there you can find our Harif video channel. We record all our talks and you can catch up with any you've missed. Just go to our website. And you can also subscribe to our mailing list if you're not already there to get details of future events. Do check out our sister website, which is Point of No Return blog, and that is updated daily to keep you informed of the news. If you have any comments or questions for our speaker, please put them in the chat, type them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. Well, without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Eve Weinberg, who will be telling us the story of her Bukharian family and their miraculous survival. Well, you might ask, how come our organization is talking about Bukhara? Because it's Central Asia, it's not quite the Middle East. But of course, the original community was part of what I consider to be the greater Babylonian diaspora. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, the Jews in that area do qualify. Bukhara is a city in present-day Uzbekistan and was a very important stop on the Silk Road. So Eve will be telling us the story of her grandparents, Aron and Adina Abramoff, whose story was actually written down by Eve's mother, but she'll tell you more about that later. It's a story of revolution and occupation, survival, and an amazing escape from Tashkent to Paris. And the miraculous survival of Eve's grandparents during the Nazi occupation in World War II. Eve herself was born and bred in London, although her parents were born in Bukhara and Tashkent. They spoke many languages, alternating between Russian, French, Bukharian, and English. She became a teacher of French and music in a secondary school in Woodside Park, which is an area in North London. And she lived there with her husband and 2 children for 46 years until the family decided to make Aliyah in February 2020, just before the pandemic. So she has now moved to Jerusalem, from where she is joining us tonight. So without further ado, over to you, Eve, and thank you very much for doing this for us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me this evening. I'm delighted to be here. I hope it's, for those in the UK, I hope it's not too hot for everybody. Anyway, I'm delighted to be able to have the opportunity to present to you this family memoir, which is entitled From Tashkent to Paris, and I hope you'll find it of interest. I've divided the talk into 3 parts: how and why the book became to be written, a very brief synopsis of Bukharian Jewry, and the book itself. So it's a very personal story of revolution, occupation, and survival. So I'm just going to share my screen to show you the cover of the book. Okay, so here you should be able to see the first slide, which is the title, the cover of the actual book. So the book was published in 2018, many years after it was bequeathed to me by my mother, who passed away in 2001. It was only after my younger brother died in 2014 and I inherited all the family photos and papers that I realised I was the last one left in the family. And if I didn't do something about it, this memoir would disappear into the ether. And I felt duty bound to fulfil my mother's wish of having her manuscript published for posterity. She was passionate about the fact that we had a rich heritage which should not be forgotten. We didn't originate from northwest London, even though we were now living there. Our roots lay somewhere totally obscure in Uzbekistan, for we were Bukharian Jews. Bukhara, Tashkent, Samarkand, Kokand were all words that we as children heard around our home, as indeed was Bukharian, a language our parents spoke if they didn't want us to understand what they were saying to one another. My mother Tamara was the second child of Aron and Adina Abramoff, who here are featured on the front cover of the book. My mother writes the memoir as though she is her own mother, recounting Adina's life from before her marriage to Aron to his final days in Paris. So I picked up my mother's manuscript, which had been handwritten in Russian. I found a floppy disk onto which an English translation had been stored, and I set to work. I looked at all the family photos and selected those that I thought would enhance and explain the story, labeling them all, trying to find out who all the people were in the photos. And I realized that my mother was helping me all the way, for she had written on the reverse of many of the photos who these people were. At the same time, I was approached by several of my cousins who had now become grandparents and who knew that over the years my mother had written down the family history, who wanted to relate the story of their grandparents' life to their grandchildren, something that had become important to them as there was now no one left in the family to answer those questions you wish you'd asked when they were alive. And once I started working on this project, I was also encouraged by many friends to publish the book, as they thought it was an untold story that people would be interested in. I wasn't so sure, so I'm grateful for their encouragement. It was a journey of discovery for me too. Although my mother was a raconteur who would regale us with stories of her childhood in Russia, she only selected the happy times. I had no idea until I read and reread the memoir how difficult their lives had been. In fact, my grandparents too, whose story this really is, whom we visited in Paris at least once or twice every year during my childhood, never alluded to the difficulties they'd gone through. They were always happy and welcoming, and there was no inkling of what terrible things they had gone through. Perhaps they just wanted to put it all behind them and not burden the younger generation with their sadness. And so back to the book. The subtitle of the book, which is here, The Story of a Bukharian Family's Triumph Over Adversity. Let me explain a little bit about Bukharian Jewry. Bukharian Jews are Sephardi Jews who take their name from a town which is now in Uzbekistan called Bukhara. So here is, hopefully, the map. It shows the picture of Uzbekistan here. It's Uzbekistan. So Bukhara was formerly in Russia, but since the breakup of the USSR, it is now in Uzbekistan. It's on the Asian side of Russia, not the European side where most Ashkenazim have their roots, bordering Afghanistan and Iran. And this area, as Lynn mentioned at the beginning, is called Central Asia. And here's an enlarged map of Uzbekistan. So Bukharian Jews come from 3 or 4 of the main cities of Uzbekistan. We've got Bukhara, Samarkand, Kokand, and Tashkent. And my grandparents' story revolves around Kokand and Tashkent. The first positive evidence of a Jewish community of Bukhara dates from about 1240. And at the end of the 16th century, the Bukharian Khanate was established as the center of Islam in the region. Jewish residence was restricted to a special quarter, and they were prevented from acquiring land and houses from Muslims. They were compelled to wear a badge to distinguish them from Muslims, and a special tax had to be paid, which was accompanied by a slap in the face. In the middle of the 18th century, Muslim fanaticism intensified, and many Jews were compelled to convert to Islam. However, from 1826 to 1860, Bukhara was ruled by the powerful Emir Nasrullah Khan, and then by his son and grandson. From this time until the Russian Revolution, Jews lived more or less peacefully in the region, as did my grandparents' families. Many prospered as merchants, traveling to Moscow on behalf of the Muslim population. They would buy cotton material printed to Muslim specification, such as hundreds of printed scarves ordered as gifts for wedding guests. On their return to Bukhara, the merchants had to stop at the city gates to pay duty in gold sovereigns. When the emir learned the names of these traders, he rewarded them for their contributions to his coffers. He ordered multicolored silk coats to be made, which he awarded to the merchants, those doing the most business receiving the greatest number of coats. So here on slide 4, I have one of those coats, which belonged to my paternal grandfather. And in Bukharian, the language, it's known as a jumma. Slide 5, this is my paternal grandfather wearing that coat. It's obviously a black and white picture. And he's wearing a typical Bukharian kippah, which is known as a topi. And it was normally made with gold thread. And that picture was taken at the Brit Milah of my oldest brother. And we go to slide 6. And here I have my father with his brother-in-law and another brother in New York. And they are wearing these traditional coats and the head covering. Most people think that the Bukharian head covering is the pyramid shape, which it is, but it's also the other shape that I showed you earlier. And these coats are now traditionally worn at the Pesach Seder. And I can remember as a child the excitement of my father donning his late father's coat at the beginning of the Seder on the eve of Pesach, looking very grand at the top of the table. And now my own son, Alexander, wears it at his Seder to continue the family tradition. He tells me it's a great talking point with his guests who have never quite seen anything like it before. And here's my son wearing my grandfather's original coat I showed you here. And he wears that on the Seder. It's over 100 years old. Anyway, in 1921, the Bolsheviks asked the ruling emir to leave peacefully. He agreed and departed with his wives and 40 children and retinue of 200 men and their families. He went into exile in Afghanistan, where he is believed to have died during the Second World War. Bukhara's climate is extreme, with temperatures rising to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, when the sun shines constantly for 3 months, to very cold winters when the temperature can fall to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with snow covering the ground for 3 months. This makes for very fertile earth, which is called black earth, Chornaya Zemlya. Bukharian Jews of my grandparents' and parents' generation were very well educated, primarily in Jewish matters, and the more successful ones also learnt to adapt to changing scenarios. At home, they would speak Bukharian, a language written in Hebrew, in fact in Rushi script, with words taken from Hebrew, Farsi, which is Persian, and Russian. And as I said before, this is the language my parents spoke to one another at home if they didn't want us, the children, to understand what they were saying. But they also learned other languages when the need arose. My paternal grandfather became a diplomat for Afghanistan because of the languages he could speak, something which saved the family when they had to leave Russia because of the revolution. My own father spoke 7 languages and my mother 4, which they picked up as they traveled from Bukhara and Tashkent to Europe. Now here are some just typical clothes of the period, the early 1900s, the sort of dresses that they wore. Very highly coloured, as you can see, reflecting the sunshine, I should think. And here's another one. And sometimes the women would cover their hair if they were religious. And I have here, if you can see, there's one of these which my grandmother made herself. one of these. And this is a lady's one, which would be worn when they got married. Okay. And so back to the book. It begins with my grandmother Adina's life in Kokand, where she was clearly very happy. Her father, my great-grandfather, owned a shop selling material for women's dresses and children's clothes. So this is a photo of Yehuda Menachemov, Adina's father. I'll just give it a quote from the book. My father was a tall, thin and calm man, devout and well respected. He had a small shop that sold material for women's dresses and children's clothes. In the mornings, he always got up to open the shop himself, even though he had several assistants working for him. At that time, we were comfortably off. My father wasn't rich, but he earned enough to enable the family to live without financial worries. He had his own house with a garden adjoining the courtyard. He had beautiful daughters. The eldest, who was 17, was already married. So marriages were mostly arranged, although the man would often contrive to check out the prospective bride. And this is what happened to my grandmother. She soon became betrothed to Aron Abramoff. They'd only previously met with chaperones present, but he bribed her little brother with ice cream so that they could have some time alone together. It became a love match, and they married in the autumn of 1912. Aron and I married in the autumn of 1912. Our wedding day was fine. The sun still shone brightly through the leaves, which were already yellowing on the trees. Red gold leaves lay scattered on the ground. They glittered in the sunshine, giving the impression that the earth was covered in gold. Oh, what a beautiful time of year, I thought. I was happy the day was mine. I was getting married to a dearly beloved man who had told me so many times that he would make me happy and that I would never want for anything. Our wedding was magnificent. I met Aron's parents as an innocent young girl. They took me to their hearts and told me how happy they were that their son had chosen me. It was a traditional relationship. She supported him in everything and looked after the children, who soon began to arrive. My mother, Tamara, was born in 1915. Aron's family had a very successful wholesale business in Tashkent that imported goods from Europe. And after his marriage, his parents opened a branch for him in Kokand so that Adina could stay near to her family. When the First World War broke out, some goods became harder to import. But things really deteriorated only when the war was going badly for the Russians and the revolution broke out in 1917. When violence reached Kokand, Aron's father, who happened to be in Kokand for his partner's son's wedding, was brutally murdered by the Basmati Kulbashi, a Muslim revolutionary group that opposed the Russians. Aron had moved his family to the suburbs, so they escaped harm, but their home was looted and burned, and this really marked the turning point in their lives. Now, here is a photograph of Raphael Abramoff, Aron's father, who was murdered in 1917. That was a time of utter sadness for us. How our lives had changed. Only the day before the fighting broke out, Aron and I had been so happy together. Now that day seemed to me to have happened long ago, like in a dream. When the news of Raphael's murder reached us, I sat still, lost in sorrowful thought. Aron went out without saying a word to me. My heart was heavy with regret that I could do nothing to help him. I didn't even know where he was going or what he was doing. I wondered how he was feeling now that his world had collapsed under his feet. That night was long and terrifying, leaving me exhausted by morning. I got up slowly. The whole day long, my head ached from weariness. I knew I had to control myself and be strong for the sake of my husband. I spent the whole day wandering about the house with tears pouring down my cheeks. At the same time, a feeling of determination grew up inside me. I decided I had to be stronger than Aron, and then I would be able to help him. Before us lay a new and frightening life. What fate had in store for us, we didn't know, but I was determined that Aron and I would struggle to mend our shattered lives. Our life didn't only encompass my husband and me and our 3 little daughters, but his entire family, his mother and 9 brothers and sisters. Now they all depended on Aron as the oldest son of the family to help them rebuild their lives. After these terrible events, Aron decided that they must join his mother in Tashkent. Her spacious house had been requisitioned, but she was allowed 2 rooms in it for her and her 9 children. The revolution brought famine, cholera, typhus, and death from hunger and cold. It was a struggle to find food, so Adina learnt to bake bread at home and to work sewing clothes for children and adults. At last, Aron managed to obtain a sack of flour and set up a bakery. It was mobbed on opening, as no one had eaten white bread for a long time, and it was allowed to operate as a collective. They called it Oslacho in Russian, Hatzlacha in Hebrew. But this was short-lived. After Lenin died, there was a struggle in the party, and in 1928, Stalin emerged as leader. As soon as he took power, he launched a new policy, the liquidation of the kulaks. He seized capital and goods and nationalized factories and plants. At night, the secret police began to arrest the heads of families and to requisition houses and possessions. People again had to flee to avoid being flung into jail, and chaos returned to the country. Under Lenin, my grandfather and his brothers had managed to open another business cleaning raw cotton and producing felt for boots and hats. My 2 uncles, David and Pinchas, were born during this time. The family had moved into a large house with a garden where they could grow vegetables and keep a cow for milk. The children were growing up and going to school. And by 1929, life had almost returned to normal. And then, half the population of our region were Muslim, and so the local day of rest was Friday. On Friday, Aron told me that a trade inspector was coming to see us to have a talk and to determine the amount of tax we should pay for that year. It seemed a little odd to me, but as tax demands were often made of us, we didn't think anything more about it. 2 men arrived at 11 o'clock in the morning. Aron opened the door to them. They entered, sat down and began to talk. Aron showed them his account books. I brought them tea and left the room. They looked around, taking note of the furniture, carpets and silver and the dresser. After drinking their tea, one of the men asked Aron the time. My husband pulled out his gold pocket watch to tell them. The man pointed to the watch and said, "What a beautiful watch you have." Aron instantly responded, "Yes, it's the only thing I have left from my dead father who was killed during the revolution. I carry it with me every day." One of the men then said, "Put it down the table, please." Aron was shocked and turned pale. Seeing this, they began to explain. "We have just come from your factory, which we have shut. We have sealed the doors and requisitioned it. You have no right to reopen it without our permission, nor do you have the right to touch your bank account." "Why are you doing this?" asked Aron. "I always pay my taxes." They shrugged their shoulders and continued to make an inventory of furniture, tables, chairs, and carpets. They examined the contents of the dresser through its glass front. Then they went into the bedroom where they noted everything down, even our quilts and pillows. Aron was ashen-faced, unable to understand what they were doing. He stood and watched them in silence, not believing his eyes. Then the men politely bade him goodbye and left. On December the 31st, New Year's Eve, my grandfather was warned by some Muslims who did business with him that there was to be a mass roundup of people that night. And as his surname started with AB, he was first on the list. The 31st of December was gala night at the opera, and in restaurants people were singing the new year. Sleighs ran about the town, their bells tinkling. From inside them you could hear tipsy young men singing loudly. It was a moonlit night with a hard frost. Snow lay 1/2 metre deep on the ground, sparkling in the moonlight. People were going home on foot in their boots and galoshes, breathing in the crystal night air and singing, not knowing that Stalin's agents were also going through the town, looking for homes where they would arrest capitalist heads of families. At 1 in the morning, there was a ring at the front door. I was prepared. I lay on my bed without sleeping, waiting while I hoped and prayed that they might not come to our house. I was so exhausted by fear that I could scarcely walk. I opened the door, and there stood two men in black coats and felt hats. They asked, "Is your husband Aron at home?" "My husband has left me and gone away, leaving me with 5 children and an empty house," I said. They wanted to search my home. We had a dining room and a bedroom. My little son slept with me in the bedroom, and our 3 daughters slept on the floor in the dining room. The men went in, looked around, and went away without a word. I closed the front door and went to bed. My grandfather then decided it was too risky to go home. And so he went into hiding in the mountains for 6 months, disguised as a Muslim. During this time, my grandmother, like many other women, went through a civil divorce, which protected her and the family, as the Stalinists only persecuted male property owners. This was a time of utter sadness for the family, and so fearing for his life, my grandfather decided there was no alternative but to emigrate. He bid a tearful farewell to his mother, who remained in Tashkent for the rest of her life, reassuring her that he would never forget her and promising to help her as much as he could, which he did. Aron went to Moscow after leaving his hiding place in the mountains, with the family following him by train, a journey of several days with very little to eat. From there, they journeyed to Leningrad, where they met up with Aron, who was overjoyed to see his wife and family again after 6 long months. It took several weeks of false starts and disappointment for their exit visas to eventually arrive in Leningrad, which would enable them to leave Russia. You may wonder how they managed to finance themselves during this time. And my mother told me that she and her older sister Susie swallowed diamonds. But my mother remained so frightened of the communists all her life that she wouldn't write about it when recounting her parents' life in this book. Their first stop was Riga, where they were struck by the abundance of food and goods in the shops and the friendliness of the people. Then they went on to Berlin, but they found it anti-Semitic. And so they went to Ghent in Belgium, where they stayed for a few months so that my mother and her sisters could continue their education and learn some French. And here I have a slide of my mother's carte d'identité. She was 15 at the time, in 1931. Yeah. But after a few months, they decided to move on again and finally opted for Paris, where my grandfather set up a small shop. At first, they were hit by the Depression, so times were hard again. But life had to go on. In 1935, my mother married Jacob Kulangiev, a young man also from Bukhara, who had made a similar journey, leaving his native Bukhara where he was born, then setting up home in Moscow until that was considered unsafe, then traveling to Berlin where he had his bar mitzvah, and then finally settling in Paris with his family, or so he thought. For 2 years after his marriage, in 1937, fearing German aggression, my father convinced my mother that they would be safer in London, where I and my 2 brothers were born. Of course, you couldn't just come to England, but there were other Bukharian Jews who'd set up home in England before them, who vouched for them, gave them a floor to sleep on and a job. And that's how they ended up in Stamford Hill, on their own, not knowing the language, and having left their nearest and dearest in Paris. And here's a picture of my parents' wedding photo. Whoops. In 1935, 31st of March 1935, and they moved yet again in 1937. They came to London. Just have a drink. During the Phoney War, both my parents' families left Paris to go south. But when they returned, they were caught by the invading German army. Aron, his 2 brothers, and his oldest son, my uncle David, were rounded up together with my father's family and many Jewish men and taken to the Tranquil internment camp, a precursor of being sent to Auschwitz. Miraculously, they and 150 other Bukharian Jews were saved by the extraordinary intervention of their family doctor, Asaf Achildi. He managed, against all the odds, to get Bukharian Jews, known as Jiggutis, declared a racial group rather than a religious group, which excluded them from the German anti-Jewish laws. The book shows letters from the Iranian consul dated October 1940, confirming that the Jews of Bukhara are of non-Jewish race. And then in August 1941, there's a notification from the German authorities that for the time being, no definite steps should be taken with regard to the Jiggutis. And then in January 42, there's a notification from the Commissariat Général aux Questions Juives, which states that the Jiggutis are not of the Jewish race and that anti-Jewish measures do not apply to them. Lists of Jiggutis were drawn up with 150 names on them, my grandfather Aron being number 42, followed by the rest of the family. The bravery and persistence of Dr. Achildi, despite the constant fear of being arrested himself, saved the lives of 150 Bukharian Jews. My mother writes sparingly about this episode in the memoir, so I decided to include Dr. Achildi's own testament as an appendix in the book. And when you read it, it is quite chilling. It is entitled The Jigguti Affair and was published by Israel's Holocaust Center, Yad Vashem, in 1967. And I'd just like to read you two extracts from Dr. Achildi's testament, which actually relate directly to my family. And for some reason, in the appendix, Dr. Achildi refers to my grandfather Aron as Arkady, and he doesn't put the surname in. I don't know why. He calls them the three brothers A, but it is obvious to me that it's the three brothers Abramoff. So he says the three brothers A, Arkady, Albert, and Daniel, and also Arkady's son David, a young man of 20, still remained in Drancy. I applied to the prefecture to release them, but the reply was, "We do not detain these protégés of yours. You will have to apply to Dr. Schultz at the Chamber of Deputies." I applied to him and he said to me, "Go to the camp at Drancy yourself and prove to them that your Jiggutis are not liable to deportation and they will be released." Heaven alone knows where I got the necessary courage and willpower to shake off my fear and go on the following day, February the 6th, to the gate of the Drancy camp. I asked to speak to the commandant as the chairman of the Jiggutis who had been sent by Dr. Schultz to release the 4 Jiggutis of Afghan origin who were confined in the camp. To my amazement, I was received by the camp commandant. To my question why the Afghans were held in the camp, although they were not in a state of war with Germany, he replied, "They're not Afghans, they're Jews." I explained to him that these people were recognized by the German authorities as not belonging to the Jewish race, although they were of the Jewish religion. I added that I had with me documents confirming my statements for each of them. He read the documents, thought a little, and then telephoned to the Chamber of Deputies. He received the answer in German that the file was in order and that 3 of the 4 Jiggutis were to be released. The 4th, the young David A., was being held for something else and must be transferred to the suspects' camp. When Arkady and Albert entered the office and heard they were being released, but that young David was to be transferred to another camp, I beheld a shocking spectacle. Arkady fell on his knees, screaming that his dear son was lost and would be hanged. For the first time throughout the Jigguti affair, I lost my temper and gave him a slap in order to bring him back to reality. I explained to him in Iranian, in the presence of the commandant and the surprised soldiers, that he must keep quiet and use the unexpected opportunity vouchsafed him and his 2 brothers to get out of this loathsome camp safe and sound. They would take care of his son also. He calmed down and left the camp weeping with his brother Albert. And then I have the story about my uncle David. And I have a cousin who's Uncle David's daughter. And before I gave everyone a book in the family. And I said to her, do you know anything about your father's story? And she'd never heard this story. He'd never, ever told her. So I told her in case she had a shock when she read it in the book. Anyway, one of the 4 representatives of the large Abramoff family, young David, had been transferred to the camp for suspects, where he was under special surveillance. His father, Akaradi, came to me every day for 3 months, weeping and imploring me and my wife to intervene through the German authorities to release his son. Doctor, he said to me, if you don't get my son out of there, my wife and I will die. I could no longer evade the issue. I was president, and that meant I was the only person who could do something. So I decided to act. The Georgians Committee suggested I appeal to Mr. Korkia. He received me courteously and humanely, and having heard me in a friendly fashion, he replied, I can't intervene personally on behalf of the young man because I represent the Georgians and not the Jiggutis. Go directly to the people who are keeping him in confinement and explain his case clearly and simply. I am certain you will succeed if all you have told me is true. When I asked to whom I should apply and how I could get in, this charming man replied with his characteristic good nature, here is my visiting card with the name and address that interest you written on it. I read the address on the card. Obersturmführer Christian, Avenue Foch 86. My head whirled and I said, but this is the Gestapo headquarters. Should I be able to get out of there alive? He replied with a smile, go and explain your case. Even if you don't obtain the release of your young man, you yourself will come out safely. I am protecting you. I couldn't sleep the night after this meeting. I couldn't decide whether to go or not. I couldn't talk to anyone, especially my wife, about this matter and the risk it involved. But I understood that the life of this young man was worth the risk I was undertaking. The following morning, therefore, I presented myself at 86 Avenue Foch and asked to speak to Obersturmführer Christian, producing Mr. Korkia's visiting card. The sentinel telephoned inside, signalled me to enter, and gave me a slip on which was written, entered 9:15. My heart was beating violently, but I retained my outward calm. I was received by a man of about 40 in civilian garb, who seemed dry and reserved, but was quite polite, and asked me first if I understood German. On my answering in the negative, he said in fair French, they phoned to tell me what you have come for, but nothing can be done about it. The young man will remain confined in the camp as a hostage for the duration, and I can't reveal the reason. Sir, I replied, the war is raging all over Europe, and you will understand that I would prefer not to endanger myself and my family were I not convinced of the innocence of this young man. I wouldn't be intervening on his behalf. As the president of this small community, it's my duty to prove to you that his imprisonment is entirely unjustified. What, in fact, are you charging him with? He looked fixedly at me, and after a moment's thought replied, we know that this young man is opposed to the German army. I replied with a smile, you should know he's nothing more than an apple salesman in his father's shop. He doesn't speak French, German, Russian or English. I'm sure that he belongs to no group or political party, and he's too much of a coward to disobey anyone. He's even less capable of doing any harm by an active outburst. I will tell you the story of his arrest and why he is detained in the suspects' camp. It all happened at the end of November last year, the same day on which a merchant well known in Paris was taken by men posing as policemen and liquidated in an underground passage. Police headquarters then published a proclamation saying that people were only to obey the orders of police carrying a special card issued by the préfecture, and in case of doubt, they were to communicate with the police secours in order to check the reliability of the order of detention. That same afternoon, a one-armed man in civilian dress came to the shop where the young man worked, and without prior warning, seized him by the collar and began to drag him towards the door. His sisters and a number of customers protested and even tried to drag him away, demanding that the man show the warrant of arrest. He replied, I don't have to show you anything. I'm carrying out orders and I'm not accountable to you. One of the customers telephoned the police secours, and when they came, he showed the required confirmation and concluded, you'll see what sort of report I shall put in on all of this row. You'll rot in a concentration camp, all of you, and never come out. And as you see, sir, you are merely carrying out the private revenge of this policeman because the report he submitted was purposely and maliciously inflated and all the details were invented. Herr Christian listened intently and said, I shall check the truth of what you say. And if it is found to be correct, The young man will be home tomorrow. But if it turns out that this is all your invention, we shall send you to join him on a charge of false testimony. I could do no more than bow my head. I rose to go. Then he burst out laughing and said, "They won't let you out." The blood froze in my veins. Then, after a very long minute, he added, "Take this slip that shows what time you left, and by showing it, you will be able to leave." I was so shaken that I nearly stumbled and fell as I went down the stairs, and I was walking like a drunkard. When I reached home, I suffered an attack of nerves that caused great concern to those about me. Precisely at noon the following day, David Abramoff was home. His family's joy was boundless. So just a digression from the book for a moment. Well, when I think of all the journeys that my parents' families took from Bukharian and Tashkent and how they had to adapt to different cultures and languages in all the countries that they temporarily stayed in, I marvel at their resilience and the normal childhood that I had. When I look at the photos of my parents and how European they look after starting out from Central Asia, it's only now that I'm a bit older and have experienced life a little, that I realise how difficult life must have been for them. It perhaps explains how precious we, the children, were to them. The fear of losing their lives or their loved ones must have stayed with them all their lives. Also, how difficult it must have been for my parents, who were in relative safety in England during the war, whilst information about what was happening across the channel to their family in France was sparse. I know they were able to get occasional telegrams from a diplomat colleague of my paternal grandfather, who actually got stranded in England during the war and lived with my parents during that time, who was part of the Afghan legation in Vichy, assuring my parents that their respective families were safe. So here are two telegrams, one from May 42 and one from October 1942. And you see the censor. In fact, they're identical. The words are identical. This was written to my father about his family and my mother's family. So it says here, toute votre famille et famille votre beau-père sont en bonne santé. All your relatives, that's my father's family, and your in-law family are all in good health, and they want information about how everyone is in London. And here, the next photo, which is taken from the book, is this wonderful man, Dr. Ochildi, who saved these 150 Bukharians, his wife and two children. And that's my mother and my oldest brother. And that was taken in 1946 in Vichy after the war. My mum went to say thank you for saving the family. So after my grandfather and his brothers and son were released from Harif, the men in the family still feared for their lives, and only the women family members served in the shop. Eventually, the war ended, and my grandparents lived the tranquil life together that I remember. Aron died in 1970, and my mother records Adina's heartbreak and reflections on the 60 years they had shared with all its ups and downs. And here is a photo, a slide, of my grandparents in 1970. I took that photo. I was coming to Israel, and I wasn't going to go to Paris that year, even though every year we'd always gone to Paris. And I decided I'd go first and then I'd go on to Israel. And I was very pleased because that was August 70 and he died in the November 1970. Now here's a couple of photos again. This is my mother and my mother Tamara here and her sister Dora. And you just see they have adapted themselves. They look quite French, actually. This was taken in Paris in 1934. And even my grandfather, who had lived most of his life in Central Asia, already got a suit, this dapper Panama hat. He's adapted himself. And that's how, you know, they managed to survive. Mind you, he didn't look like that after the war. This is 1936. And then we come back to the book cover, which shows my grandparents in their flat in Paris. And this red and gold background is taken from a Bukharian dress from Tashkent. And I merged the two to make the cover of the book. And I'd just like to read you one more short extract from the beginning of the book, which actually explains my mother's philosophy on life, which stood her in good stead all her life. If at some time in your life you find yourself in difficulties and fear that you will never overcome them, when you begin to lose your hope, strength, self-confidence, will and faith in God, then read this book, not once, but many times over, and it will help you understand that however desperate the situation may seem, your life may change for the better. When you start to fear that the end is near and that there's nothing more to be done, after you've tried various means of escape and you are tired in body and soul, suddenly some idea or chance meeting will occur and everything will change. Fresh hope will spring up in your heart. You will strive again with renewed energy and your life will be sure to improve. As you pull yourself out of your difficulties, you will even find humour in the situation and say to yourself, how could all that have happened? Why didn't I think of the solution earlier? Sometimes you seem to trot through life on horseback, and at other times the horse seems to drag you along behind it. But there is always the hope that you will leap onto that horse and gallop away without a backward glance. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Eve. That was absolutely wonderful. Your mother's a natural writer, isn't she?
Yes, yes.
Absolutely fantastic. And do you have any more details about the doctor who saved your grandfather? I mean, what motivated him?
Well, the fact that he actually saved the family, there is a family folklore, is that my grandfather had saved someone in his family in Bukharian and Tashkent, and therefore he felt he owed it to the family to save them. Mm-hmm. But he did it for everybody. I mean, he really put himself at risk for everybody in that community. Mm-hmm. He never declared to the German authorities that he was Jewish. Never declared it, so he never got arrested. His wife, it says at the beginning of the appendix that I put in the book, his wife advised him not to declare. He was going to declare, and she said, don't declare it.
And was his wife Jewish?
Yes, they were all Jewish. They were all Jewish, but they concocted this, story. It's amazing. It's amazing they got away with it, really.
Yeah, they got away with it. I think the Karaites also got away with it. They were declared non-Jewish in terms of race. Yeah. Do you know whether Yad Vashem has ever recognised the doctor? Yeah. Well, he obviously wasn't a righteous Gentiles.
No, that's the problem. So they only recognise righteous Gentiles. But I discovered on the B'nai B'rith website that his daughter, one of the picture, she was about 96 and she moved, most people left Europe afterwards, after all this terrible thing. They went to Canada. And I've discovered on the B'nai B'rith website that they had actually given her some sort of commendation for what her father had done. And because I discovered it, I actually sent an email to B'nai B'rith and they gave me the email of this lady, but in fact, she had just passed away 2 years ago, and they put me on to the son. And I spoke to the son. I said, your grandfather saved my grandparents and what have you. And we spoke, we had a very long chat. And he said, well, when I next come to Israel, we will meet. We must meet and we must discuss things. So it's really, quite interesting. So he was recognized, even though latterly. So the daughter did take his commendation for her late father.
Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. He did get recognition. I think B'nai B'rith are out there to recognize Jews that actually helped Jews during the war as well. So, anyway.
Great. Well, I'm just looking at the chat to see if there are any questions. I think there was a query from Annette about the robe or coat you showed. There's a braid around the edges. Were these braids made by the Jews? I don't know. Can you?
No, you mean the ikat braid? It probably is the same. This, like on this as well.
Hold it up again. Yes.
This sort of thing. Yeah. This is my grandmother actually made this. She gave all the grandchildren one. She actually sewed all that. She did it with her treadle machine. I remember her doing it all. So this, I think, I don't know if it was made by the Jews, but it's where is it?
Yes.
It's the sort of thing. People think this is the only thing that they wear, but they do. This has become what everyone's associates with the Bukharian Jews.
Yes, that very distinctive pattern on the.
Well, that from Nigel Grizzard. There was actually, the Bukharian shul was on Amherst Park because my father ran it. The Persian shul was in East Bank. It was the Persian shul actually, but they had a lot to do with one another. Yeah. They had, you know, because my father was involved with, it was Dr. Rabbi Badil that helped both those communities. They had an Ashkenazi rabbi, but he helped both of them. But my father ran, it was number 3 Amherst Park, because we used to go to that until we moved to Finchley.
So a couple of Jewish geography questions there. I think Patricia Abram, her original name was Abramoff. So we are related, she says.
Oh, so Yaffa Abramoff, Yaffa, I have your book. Whoever, that's Patricia, is it? I have your book, which my mother had. I have it here, and I've read that, but it's a fascinating story too. And my mother was very fond of your mother. Yaffa, I can remember Yaffa.
Okay. And there's another, I think it's Lawrence, husband of Leslie Hakim Dweck, who's also from Bukhara.
So Miriam and Johnny Abramoff. Actually, Abramoff is actually quite a common name. It's really just Abraham, from Abraham, obviously, so it's Abraham. So Johnny Abramoff was the cousin to Morris Abramoff, who was married to my Aunt Susie, my mother's older sister. So that's the connection. They're actually first cousins. So I'm not really directly related, but there is a connection.
So the question is, where can we buy the book?
Well, I do have copies of the book. I have, you can buy it from me if anyone should be interested. You can email me on, I can write it in the chat actually. Yes. It's actually from tashkenttoparis@gmail.com. Right. I can write that in the chat if you want.
Yes, please, that would be great. Or if anyone wants to get in touch with Harif, info@harif.org, I can pass on the...
would you rather do it that way?
I don't mind either. Well,
I'll put this in if anyone wants to. From tashkenttoparis@gmail.
And just a question about your grandmother's father who's murdered in 1917. Do you have any idea whether it was an anti-Semitic murder, or was he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time?
I think
what were the circumstances?
I think it was through the revolution. Firstly, they were Muslim. There was the Basmati Kubashi who were against the revolution. I think he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But obviously, the way they dressed and with the beard and the moustache, they looked Jewish. They looked Jewish. So I don't know. I mean, there's no one left to ask those questions, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was just reading about a monument that was recently unveiled in Uzbekistan. Apparently, the Uzbeks saved over 1 million people during World War II, including 200,000 Jews. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, because I think in the Second World War, people were sent. European Ashkenazi Jews were sent to Uzbekistan and to be safe there. And I actually went to a lecture once at UC rather, and there's some lady in America who's doing all this research, because I asked a question whether the Sephardi Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews ever got together, because it was quite a different background, everything. Yes. And suddenly they had these Hasidim, a lot of Hasidim came to Uzbekistan. They must have found it a real culture shock, but I would imagine what this lady was telling me, most people stayed within their own, you know, because stay with the people they're familiar with.
Right. Okay. So despite Stalin and everything, the Uzbeks were actually quite good to the Jews.
Yes, because my mum always said that my father was in Moscow. He saw the revolution out of the flat window, but my mother stayed in Central Asia for much longer, and she said they were not really bothered for some. You know, it took a long time for them to come to Central Asia. Moscow was the focal point of it at the beginning. The revolution, so they had a few years when they thought they could rebuild their lives and what have you, but it didn't work out, and my grandfather decided it's best to go.
Best to go, yes.
Yeah.
And what an amazing story of how he escaped the clutches of the Germans in France.
I think that actually is an unknown story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I don't know if there are any more questions.
There is Caroline Conley. He's asking, she's in Jerusalem. I'm in Jerusalem. You can get a book from me here.
Yeah.
Again, if you use the same email, the Gmail, I can sort you out from there.
Yeah, no problem there.
And in London, it's okay if anyone wants to buy it in London as well. It's okay. If anyone should be interested, but that's not the purpose of the talk. As my mother always said, she just wanted everyone to know about the story because it was an unknown story, and she really felt it ought to be out there.
Absolutely. Well, we're all in favour of making unknown stories.
Yes, I know.
Public, as you know.
Well, thank you for having me tonight. I hope you will enjoy it.
Explain what has got a question. So can you put it in the Q&A? It'll be much easier.
Yeah. Okay. And Sophia Shamiev's Mother Winter, is that another memoir?
No.
You haven't heard of that?
Shalamoyev. I spelt it. I used to spell it with a C-H-A-L. Shalamoyev. Those people I knew from London. They were friends of my parents.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and then Philip Spain. I think this is a book by Kankahi Goldberger about European Jews in Bukhara. Thank you for that. We'll look it up. Absolutely lovely. So do you know what's happened to the community now? I mean, do you have any idea of, I mean, are they all in Israel? Are they in New York?
People came out, a lot of people came out earlier. I mean, my father's family, I know, some came to Israel straight away, even though the state wasn't the state. Now, in 1936, my father's first cousin, they came here and they made their lives here. The rest went to Europe. Yeah. But I think once the revolution and afterwards, they've all left. There's very few there.
Very few there.
And people have come out, as I say, with the family came out in 1992. There was a mass exodus. People were allowed to come to Israel. So a lot of people got up and came while they could.
Yes, as part of the general
Aliyah to Israel.
Aliyah to Israel from Russia or ex-Soviet Union.
Yeah, so they were included.
Absolutely, great. Well, I think there's another Jewish geography question there from Patricia. Perhaps you can correspond with Eve later on.
Yes.
And Marion says that mostly old people remain in Bukhara, more in Tashkent, right? That seems to be the same old story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
with all these diminishing communities. So I think we've come to the end of the questions and comments. It remains for me just to thank you so much, Eve. That was absolutely fascinating. And I know everybody's in agreement with me here. All those who've written comments. So thank you again, and wish you all the best disseminating this story. All those who want to get hold of the book, just either email me or email Eve at the website, at the address she's given on the chat.
Future events,
yes, and as Samish has just made a comment, what about Aliyah from Bukhara as the first issue? Oh yes, of course, the Bukharian quarter in Jerusalem.
Oh yes, so that
we know about that. Yeah.
Yes, so there is a shul in the Bukharian quarter. People sent money ahead of them in the hope that they would always go to Jerusalem because they always have their eye on Zion.
Yes.
And one shul, my father's family has one of the shuls there. Babayif is a Harif shul. And there's a photo of my father outside the shul when he came to Israel many, many years ago. So people, they did come. Some came much earlier and then the rest came later.
Right. So do check out the Bukharian shul.
I have been there. There was an old age home which I went to as well, and I told them who I was. It's now taken over by the state and what have you. But yes, the Bukharian quarter is still there and called the Bukharian quarter. And people, surprisingly enough, people in Israel know about Bukharian people and about the background, whereas in Europe, I think very few people do actually know. But in Jerusalem, they seem to be aware of it.
Yes, yes. And it is strange that, you know, a single city is associated with a community, isn't it? Like, you don't talk about the Persian or the Afghan.
Yes.
Oh, well, the Babylonians, of course. Okay, and just another couple of questions there. I know the answer to that one. Have you been to Uzbekistan, from Nigel? Yeah.
No.
You haven't.
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah. Carol plays
Bukharian Jewish
music. Very interesting.
Yep.
Okay, well, I think we will call it a day or call it a night.
Yeah, just
yes, forthcoming events. We're kind of winding down a little bit over the summer, so there will be only one Harif lockdown lecture in August, and that will be delivered by me. So I hope to see somebody on the 23rd of August, when my subject will be the colonial era. Was it good for the Jews? And then we resume at full speed in September. Do check out our website, and we've got a few advertisements for the future events as well. So I think it just remains for Lawrence to unmute everybody if anyone wants to say goodbye or thank you or anything, and we will stop the recording.
Have a proper name, I will take you out the meeting now, okay?
Punishment. So if you don't mind staying on a little bit, Eve.
I don't mind staying on, but I've lost everybody. Oh yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Right, everyone can now unmute themselves.
Okay.
And question mark is no longer there.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Anyway, I hope it was interesting.
It was very interesting.
It was.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Yeah, really good. Very interesting.
I missed the first part. Do you think I could see the
There will be a video up in within a couple of days. It may even be tonight if I can get my act together.
Can I say that, first of all, thank you so much. That was so interesting. Before the pandemic, Harry and I went on a trip to Uzbekistan, a Silk Road trip. And when we were in Samarkand, we requested, it wasn't a Jewish group, we requested, when we were in Bukhara, we asked the leader of the group if we could go to the synagogue. She arranged it, and she said, it's not just you going, we're taking the whole group. We were the only Jewish people it was about 25 people. So we all went to the synagogue in Bukhara. It's a beautiful little synagogue, down a back street, obviously, hidden away. And the leader of the community welcomed us, and it looked a very well-kept synagogue. And he mentioned that they have a Jewish school there. So there must be some young families.
Yes, I think it's the Chabad that have actually moved in there, from what I've been told.
Maybe.
I'm not 100% sure, but
it was really thrilling to go there. Did you want to add anything?
Well, just to say that apart from that, Bukhara was my favourite one of the Uzbek cities. It's actually a lovely place to wander around. Some fabulous architecture, nice coffee shops.
and the handicrafts in Uzbekistan are just phenomenal. They're just wonderful. I could have bought the whole country. You know?
Didn't buy yourself a Bukharian carpet. They're very famous for their carpet.
No.
Their rugs.
Can I just put a plug in? The group we went with is a company called Transindus. It's run by a Sikh lady who lives in Ealing. And she was very interested in the Jewish background. And so it might be worth contacting her if you want to go.
Nigel went with Zion Tours. So that's another option. Presumably there are tour groups that go from Israel.
There are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's still happening because of the pandemic, but I think it might happen again once it's a bit, you know, again gets back to normal. There are trips that go from here.
So
our guide,
bucket list.
our Uzbek guide said we have lots of groups from Israel. This was obviously before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you for that. Thank you.
Okay.
Could I just mention, we actually visited my husband's family in New York, in Rego Park, and there seemed to be a huge Bukharian community there.
Yes.
And they kept all their traditions, wearing their Bukharian coats, drinking a lot of vodka as well.
That's from being in Russia. Yeah. I don't think that's not Bukharian, that's Russian.
Yeah, I don't know where it came from, but I mean, it was almost like being transported in another world. So there's quite a sizable community there.
Yes, I know. I've been in touch. There's a professor actually, Rybakov. I've been in touch with him. He actually does a course on Bukharian Jewry in an American university, and I've been in touch with him. Actually, I sent him my book. Thought he might be interested. So we've been corresponding. So
fantastic.
Yeah, so people are trying to get it out there.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So, I think in Queens, they've got a very big community.
Yes, I think they call it Little Bukhara.
Sorry, what was that? I don't know who's speaking, actually. I can't see.
It's Leslie. Leslie's speaking.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. And she said that they call it Little Bukhara.
Oh, right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, these, I think, Bukharis must have come out after my parents' story is before the revolution and after, but I think the people there now must have come out more recently. They must have lived more recently.
Yes, it was mid-90s because my husband visited them while they were still in Bukhara.
That's right. So
in Samarkand in 93.
Yeah. So some came to Israel and some went to the States.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. So they recreated Bukhara in the States.
Yeah.
So, nice.
Yeah, it was lovely.
Lovely. Good.
Okay. So I think we shall all go and have a cold shower now.
Very hot.
And a lot of ice cubes. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you again, Eve, and wish you all the best, and have a good summer, everyone, and hope to see you for our next lecture on the 23rd of August. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Liv. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.